Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Today, take a moment to listen to this strange and fascinating story from World War II, one that very few people know about. Munich, 1934. A hotel room door burst open and the room filled with grey uniforms marked by skulls. Ernst Röhm lifted his head from the pillow, blinking at the light. Dragged upright, he looked at the men and told them if they were going to take his life, let Adolf do it himself. They were part of the unit he helped create, yet they were no longer his men. Their allegiance was clearly displayed on their cuffs. Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, chosen for strength, drilled past hesitation, taught to obey without question. They were bodyguards built backward, protecting their leader not by shielding him, but by striking first at those who stood too close. Tonight, they secured Germany for their Führer. Next, they would turn that devotion outward, and Europe would burn for it. It was November 9th, 1923. Adolf Hitler was still far from being the feared Führer of Germany, yet he was already leading a force of 2,000 men as they marched through the streets of Munich. Bound for the Bavarian Defense Ministry, the Nazis had not yet conquered the nation, and at that moment their only real chance of seizing power was to take control by force. That was precisely what these men intended to do. These were not regular soldiers, they were members of the paramilitary unit known as the Sturmabteilung, or SA, which translates to Storm Division. This was a ruthless clan forged by German military officer Ernst Röhm, one of Hitler's earliest allies. These were men willing to fight dirty and smash through opposition to clear the path for Hitler to lead them into a reborn Germany. As the march continued, they were confronted by a force of 130 German soldiers. Hitler had the numbers, but his rivals were far more prepared for combat, ready to fire the moment any SA man dared to take another step. For a brief moment there was a standstill. Yet neither Hitler nor the men by his side backed down. This was their moment to prove how serious the Nazi movement was. Then the shooting began. For decades to come, this would be known by Hitler and his allies as the Blutfahne, or blood flag, and almost a holy relic within the Third Reich, that symbolized the sacrifice the Führer and his faithful clan endured that day. 16 Nazis had lost their lives, and soon he would be sentenced to prison for his insurrection. Yet the battle was far from over, and when Hitler walked out of his cell in 1924, he was determined to rebuild and fortify the personal guard that, in his mind, would one day secure his total grip on the country. It would still take Hitler several years before he could seize absolute power. In the 1920s, the Nazis were far from being the most popular party. But when the Great Depression struck in late 1929, deepening the economic hardships for most Germans, the country began to pay closer attention to Hitler's message. By the early 1930s, more than 6 million people were casting their votes for the Nazis, enabling Hitler to gradually secure control of the entire nation. At his side, the ever-faithful SA ensured no one dared to challenge his rise. Yet when Hitler was finally appointed Chancellor in 1933, and crowds of SA men marched before his residence with torches in a celebratory parade, a dark thought began to gnaw at him. These were the men who had helped secure his ascent to power, but there was nothing that guaranteed that they couldn't one day turn against him. With each passing month, the SA grew larger, and their leader, Ernst Röhm, gained more power over Germany's fragile new government. One thing Hitler despised above all was having anyone stand above him. One way or another, he would claim his spot as the nation's ultimate unchallenged leader. Just months into his chancellorship, Hitler began expanding a special guard unit drawn from the paramilitary group known as Schutzstaffel, or SS. What had begun with little more than 100 men soon grew to nearly 800 by November, when, during a commemoration in Munich for the 10th anniversary of the failed beer hall putsch, Hitler demanded that his new guard swear a binding oath. From that moment, the unit became Hitler's personal bodyguard, officially titled the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, or LSSAH. They did not swear loyalty to Germany, not to any law or institution, but to Hitler himself. They wore his name on their cuff titles, each man pledging unconditional obedience and service unto death. The men of the SS took their preparation to serve the Nazi regime one step further than Röhm's SA ranks. Only young, able-bodied men who embodied the Nazi ideal of Aryan purity were accepted, men of so-called pure German blood with muscular physiques, flawless health, and even perfect teeth. Once these aspiring candidates made it past the first selection, they had to endure further physical and psychological tests to prove they could withstand the unit's relentless demands. Heinrich Himmler, who became one of Hitler's most loyal officials and the undisputed leader of the SS, designed a training regimen that emphasized a wide range of sports to keep the men in peak condition. Unlike the traditional Wehrmacht soldiers, who focused more on strategy and controlled drills, SS men were driven to the breaking point. They trained with live munitions, endured the harshest conditions, and were molded to believe that even against an entire enemy platoon, armed with nothing but their bare hands, they still had a fighting chance. The entire system existed to weed out the weak, leaving behind only the most ruthless, machine-like men to serve in the SS. Beyond physical training, indoctrination was relentless. Day and night the recruits were pounded with Nazi propaganda, ensuring that by the time they donned their uniforms they were ready to put the regime above all else. Throughout the 1930s, the LSSH had the unique honor of not only serving as Hitler's personal guard, but also as the men entrusted with carrying out the darkest missions of the Nazi Party, and soon enough they would have the chance to prove just how far they were willing to go for their Führer. By 1934, tensions between Adolf Hitler and Ernst Röhm, along with many other SA leaders, had reached a boiling point. Röhm rejected the direction the Nazi Party was taking. He demanded harsher economic policies to favor the working classes and openly proposed that his SA troops, which had now swelled into the millions, should replace the German army as the nation's official military. Hitler would never accept any of this. Instead, he met with Heinrich Himmler to discuss how to silence the opposition within his own ranks once and for all. On June 30th, 1934, Hitler and his guards stormed into a Bavarian hotel in Bad Weisse, where a group of SA leaders were staying. Some were shot on the spot, others were arrested and sent either to Stadelheim prison in Munich or to SS buildings, where they were swiftly executed without ever having the chance to properly defend themselves against charges of treachery. Even after years of serving Hitler, Röhm himself was not spared. Days later, Hitler framed the massacre as a necessary act of national security, claiming Röhm and the SA had been plotting a coup against his government. However, the purge extended far beyond the SA's leadership. Opposition leaders, former chancellors, disillusioned Nazis who had abandoned the party, and even Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the Bavarian commissioner who had helped stop Hitler's failed Munich putsch more than a decade earlier, all fell victim to the massacre. This purge would be remembered as the Night of the Long Knives, and thanks to the decisive role of the LSSH in it, Hitler had not only taken his revenge, but also removed the last major internal threat to his power. The SS quickly rose to become Nazi Germany's primary paramilitary force. Its units were granted new powers, and the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler was rewarded with motorized equipment, expanded to the size of a full regiment. With Germany firmly under their control, the next natural step for these men was to extend their reach beyond the nation's borders. In 1935 they got their first chance when Nazi forces marched into the Saarland, a territory occupied by France since World War I and which Hitler now sought to reclaim. During this operation, the LSSH did not see combat, as the locals broadly welcomed the Nazis with open arms. Still, for the Leibstandarte it was a vital lesson. They learned how to conduct military deployment, establish authority on foreign ground, and secure an efficient occupation. These skills would be practiced again in the years to come, during the annexation of Austria and later the Sudetenland. By the time Hitler escalated his ambitions toward Poland, the Leibstandarte had become nearly indistinguishable from the regular German army. They wore the same field grey uniforms, their only distinctions being the SS runes on their collars and a skeleton key insignia unique to the LSSAH. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, the unit was among the first to cross the border into Germany's first official victim. Polish forces were no match for the battle-hardened Leibstandarte, but for the LSSH, victory alone was not enough. These men had been conditioned for brutal combat, and they would have it one way or another. Even after securing the terrain, they showed no mercy to those unfortunate enough to fall into their path. Villages were set ablaze, homes torched to the ground. Not even defenseless civilians were spared, and the Leibstandarte was only getting started because as Poland fell, Hitler's sights were already locked onto his next targets. In 1940, the men of the LSS Dart were once again marching across Germany's borders, this time heading into the Netherlands, tasked with securing the nation as part of the opening blow of the invasion of France. Within only 4 days, the unit managed to advance over 134 miles of terrain toward the capital, which surrendered shortly after the operation began. With the Netherlands under their command, the men of the Leibstandarte could now support the final strike against France. Flanked by other German formations, the LSSH was sent toward the shrinking Allied perimeter at Dunkirk. Thousands of British and French soldiers had been pushed back against the coast, their defences collapsing. It was here, however, that Hitler ordered his men to halt, refraining from giving the all-clear for a massacre of the trapped forces this early in the war. But the men of the Leibstandarte were not accustomed to sitting still while enemies dangled before them. Their commander, Josef Dietrich, identified a group of British artillery observers who had set up a position overlooking German movements. Hitler's orders had been clear, but Dietrich's nature called for action. He rallied his men, guided them into the enemy's position, and unleashed a storm of fire that showed no mercy, ensuring that if the Allied soldiers did not fall, they would at least abandon their position and think twice before coming back. The assault did not stop there. As the Germans resumed their march, the Leibstandarte seized a nearby village and forced every soldier to surrender. The prisoners, numbering over 80, were corralled into a barn, where they were brutally executed in one of the most gruesome war crimes committed by the unit. With France under German control, the LSSH continued to grow, amassing more than 6,500 men. By late 1940, they were deployed once again, this time to aid in the Balkans campaign. The unit moved with violence, smashing through British platoons, overwhelming defenders, and cutting off retreating troops as the Wehrmacht drove across Yugoslavia and into Greece. By the end of April, after the Allies had been expelled from the country, the Leibstandarte marched triumphantly through Athens. By 1941, the LSSAH had grown into one of the most feared and fanatical formations in the Nazi arsenal. They had proven themselves across multiple fronts, and Hitler, aware of their effectiveness, was ready to unleash them against the most formidable enemy they had yet faced, the Soviet Union. By the time German troops began marching into Soviet territory, the LSSAH numbers had grown to nearly 11,000 men. Though it initially lacked the advanced equipment of regular army units, the LSSAH was gradually refitted into a Panzer Grenadier Division, equipped with armoured vehicles that allowed it to drive deeper into the nation. Among their new weapons was the brand new Tiger I heavy tank, armed with an 88mm K-36 gun and protected by 100mm of frontal armour. With this beast, the Leibstandarte smashed through Soviet defences, its shells tearing apart platoons in a single strike as villagers tried desperately to hold the line. Still, the Leibstandarte tank crews were not the worst of the LSSH. Once they reached a town, Hitler's chosen men unleashed a terror that would mark the Soviets for generations. The exact number of POWs and civilians that were executed, or the exact details on how they did it, remains contested, but widely accepted testimonies by both historians and former SS members who were captured and interrogated after the war paint a picture of brutality without restraint. Amongst the most infamous men of the unit was Commander Kurt Meyer, who is said to have called for the eradication of entire villages without even flinching, making him feared even by fellow LSSH men. Yet Meyer's cruelty did not go unchallenged. Under Colonel Joachim Peiper, entire homes and churches were set ablaze, earning his unit the nickname the Blowtorch Battalion. For these crimes, the LSSH became one of the most hated SS divisions on the Eastern Front, and the Soviets vowed that whenever the opportunity came, they would make the Leibstandarte pay for every one of the atrocities they had committed, and by 1943 they would finally get their chance for revenge. As the German advance faltered, the Soviets gathered strength. By summer, they were ready to launch a counter-offensive that promised to finally expel the Nazis from their country. On July 12th, Operation Kutuzov began. A storm of 800,000 soldiers and nearly 2,500 tanks smashed into German lines, overwhelming their defences, severing supply routes and strangling communications. The Germans were left to fend for themselves as Soviet forces closed the noose around them faster than they could respond. The men of the LSSH fell by the hundreds, losing their grip on towns almost overnight as the Red Army surged through the positions they had clung to for months. It was now undeniable the balance in the Soviet Union was shifting. If the Germans were to withstand the counterattack, they would need every ounce of strength to face it head-on. But Hitler could no longer commit his elite fighters to a single front, as the Soviets drove violently from the east. The Allied invasion of Italy threatened to open a new front from the south. The Führer knew sending the LSSH to Italy was a gamble, but he had no choice, and so before the Leibstandarte could finish the mission for which they had been deployed, they were forced to turn back, abandoning most of their tanks to the forces left behind to try and halt the Soviet tide. In Italy, the story was similar to the disaster in the Soviet Union. Despite securing a handful of victories, the Germans could not stem the Allied advance, and by 1944 it was clear that Germany's Axis partner was doomed. Yet for Hitler the nightmare was only just beginning. In June 1944, Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion the world had ever seen, unleashed over 1 million men onto the beaches of occupied France. Once again the LSSAH was dispatched to stiffen the German defence. When it became clear that France was lost, the Leibstandarte had no other alternative but to flee eastward. Yet it was already too late. American, Canadian and Polish forces closed in from every direction, sealing them inside the Falaise pocket. There the division suffered one of its most devastating defeats, with over 5,000 casualties and the loss of all its remaining equipment. Joachim Peiper, the infamous commander who had become known for torching entire villages on the Eastern Front, fought hard to achieve that revenge. Before the LSSH was expelled from Belgium, his Kampfgruppe managed to capture nearly 130 American prisoners. There was little to gain from taking them out, but under Peiper's command the order was given anyway. On a cold field near Malmedy, around 84 men were gunned down. By mid-April 1945, Josef Dietrich, commander of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, received the order he hoped he would never accept from his Führer. His men had failed to hold Austria against the advancing Soviets, who were now only a stone's throw from Germany. Hitler's message was clear. Without exception, every SS soldier who had once borne his name on their uniform was to strip it away. They were no longer his chosen ones, condemned for not fighting as the situation demanded. The LSSH was now a shadow of its former self, reduced to barely 1,600 men and just over a dozen tanks. Some men surrendered outright, preferring to fall into American hands rather than join the fanatics destined for a final stand in Berlin. For those taken prisoner by the Western Allies, the war ended in trials. Among them was Kurt Meyer, one of the most feared commanders of the Eastern Front, who during his imprisonment declared, "I wish a lot of the officers here could command my division, so that they might learn some inkling of self-sacrifice and fanaticism." Although he was initially condemned to execution, the courts allowed him to serve life behind bars instead. However, he was released in 1954. For those captured by the Soviets, the fate was far harsher. The Red Army never forgot the villages the LSSH had burned, or the civilians they had slaughtered. SS prisoners were sent east to labor camps, where they were worked to exhaustion, broken by the brutal climate and the merciless hand of their captors. That was the end of one of Hitler's cruelest creations. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Today take a moment to listen to this strange and fascinating story from World War II, one that very few people know about.